very kind introduction, and it's really very nice to be here again and to be here in person as well. I was just recalling that it's been, I think, 7 years since I visited last, and I just realized that actually the questions that I was asking during the talk that I presented then were very similar to the questions I still have. I'm still asking, using different source materials, using different primary sources. But I'm afraid that I'm still really working with questions on how Buddhism and law are related, particularly in Tibet. And I will just dive right in here. And I also have to check the technology of this, because now I don't know how to flick my... I have to be able to move my PowerPoint somehow.
Okay, I'll help you.
But and also I have to see whether to stand or to sit with this this setup.
You just click here.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I can make this a bit longer.
No, you will have to come closer, and then.
I will just remain standing for now. So, within Buddhist studies, there has been, and still is, it seems, considerable disagreement on the relationship between Buddhism and law. Of course, it's I would say it's historically understudied, but the subject of Buddhism and law has fortunately received more academic attention in the past decades, and scholars in the past have equated Buddhist ethics or Buddhist philosophy with Buddhism. And from that angle, they have looked at Buddhism and law. So for example, so Berthe Davis has written, in the strict sense of the word, there is no Buddhist law. There's only an influence exercised by Buddhist ethics on changes that have taken place in customs. Now, on the other extreme, Rebecca French has posited, at least for the case of Tibet, that mind training and inner morality are also at the center of the legal system for Tibetan Buddhists. And she also has said, after that all laws were understood as religious. Now, for the larger topic of Buddhism and law in Asia, recently scholars such as Christian Lammerts and Ben Chantal have attempted to find some sort of a middle ground in which Buddhist practice, that is, what Buddhists do as evidenced either in text or by human conduct, takes center stage. Still, in a very recent work that deals with conflict in a Tibetan Buddhist society, which is an absolutely excellent work. Oh, sorry, the slide doesn't display the thing entirely correctly. Buddhism is yet again sort of equated with Buddhist moral principles. So he writes, although Tibetan tradition claims that the law has Buddhist roots, the history and content of Tibetan law nonetheless show no influence of Buddhist morals and ethics, I think the word is. He also writes that Tibetan law is not a sacral law, and this is perhaps in the way you can think of the Islamic Sharia as a sacral or sacred law. And I think that is indeed correct, but I think it is problematic to equate the Buddhist law, as it's often, the Dharma is often translated, with the laws of, for, and by Buddhists. And this is a point that I will return to later on. So the statement I want to make, maybe a bit bold, is that when we look at Buddhism as a societal phenomenon, we need to develop a broader parameters of how we define Buddhism. And also similarly, we have to develop, on the other hand, we have to develop a more comprehensive idea of the law. So what, for example, is or can be Buddhist about the death penalty? So I wrote something about this, came out last year. But if you see Buddhism as a set of ethics, we would have to say, what is Buddhist about the death penalty? Well, precious little is Buddhist about the death penalty, taking someone's life. But saying that would be denying both the history and the legal agency of people who self-identify as Buddhist. So I would argue, to put it bluntly, and also citing Forrest Gump rather freely, Buddhist is as Buddhist does. So the other issue is how we should define the law. And then the question arises, is it the law that is carried out when it is not state-related or state-regulated? Or when there is no state the way we nowadays define state or government? Or is that, whatever these people do then, is that just custom? Or you can also say social legal custom. Or you can even complicate matters further. And when the state mandates the clergy, the Sangha, to temporarily take over temporal control, can we then see the clergy as executors of state law or even secular law? And this is another issue that I've written about a few years ago. An example of exactly this is what happened a few weeks, a year, right after the Tibetan New Year during the Great Prayer Festival. And this is when the monks of Drepung Monastery would be handed over the reins of Tibet's capital city, Lhasa. And this was not just symbolic. The monks at that point really ruled the city, and they had executive power, and also evidence suggests that they were not afraid of using it. And this is a picture of exactly sort of the ceremony of the government handing over control to the monks. So as I said, Buddhist is as Buddhist does, and one absolutely risks the danger of essentializing Buddhism when we extrapolate a set of values or definitions and use that as the yardstick for measuring how Buddhist something actually is. And sadly, I mean, this is how certain scholars who study Tibetan history, for instance, still operate. So it makes sense to really try to understand what Buddhist people did and still do in certain societal contexts. And here I want to pay particular attention to how monks vis-a-vis lay people dealt with specific legal issues. And the examples that I will give and some of the arguments that I will make will in this talk will appear in an article in a book on Buddhism and constitutional law, which is set to come out with Cambridge University Press and edited by Tom Ginsberg and Ben Chantal. So previous research has shown that many Tibetan Buddhist monasteries were distinct legal entities with the power to put on trial and to punish not just the monks, but also lay people interacting with the monks or with the monastery. Only in cases of murder did it become a matter of state legal authorities, at least in theory. Now, here I am interested in the interaction between monastic law and state law, that is, and also the people enforcing these laws. So, while in the case of Bhutan, certain state regulations were actually based on existing sets of monastic guidelines, Jai, so this is what my previous research has taken as primary sources. So they have, for the state regulations, they have taken a set of monastic guidelines as a basis. This suggests that monastic law directly inspired secular governmental policy. But for the picture of Tibet is, historical Tibet is less clear. So looking at the language of some of the secular legal texts, and I will keep on using this parentheses for secular, knowing that it's a very complex issue. So bear with me here. So secular legal text, meaning here very simply not directed at religious actors per se. So looking at these texts, there are indications that their authors were very much aware of the internal monastic laws, and that these secular legal texts also accommodated these laws, internal laws. And in the same way, worked the other way around as well, monastic rule books pointed out the situations in which monks were actually subject to state law. So while religion and law are not easily separable in the case of historical Tibet, I here attempt to demonstrate the potential mutual influences and legal concerns of these two, you could say, normative systems. So in the context of pre-1950s Tibet, Buddhist monasteries can be seen as communities that not only governed themselves, but also exercised political and judicial power far beyond the monastery's boundary markers. And the monastery's relative autonomy, their power, and unique legal status mean that a study of Tibet's legal system would be incomplete without considering monastic laws. You could even say constitutional laws. Also, there are a number of indications that monastic concepts of law influenced the Tibetan state's legal procedures. So I want to explore a number of these influences in this talk. So regarding the so-called monastic ideologies of law, one has to be aware that they are hardly ever found explicitly in legal literature. This is, of course, unfortunate. It makes my job really hard. But this is also significant since I quote, despite the many remarkable achievements of Tibet's religious leadership in areas of culture, including literature and the arts, philosophy, and spiritual discipline, sustained reflection on the basis of political organization itself was never part of traditional learning. And I would add to that, not just political organization, but also legal thinking, let's say, thinking about laws. And in a similar way, Ruegg has also written that the search for the theoretical models and ancient Indian historical precedents which might have served Tibetan thinkers is, however, no straightforward matter, for our Tibetan sources are not as explicit on the subject as we would wish. In a similar vein, Tucci has written, the search for theoretical models and ancient Indian there is no profane literature to speak of because culture belonged entirely to the monks. Even the laws which ruled Tibet for several centuries although bearing the names of the kings who enforced them, were almost certainly written down by lamas. So, by extension then, the primary sources available today do not contain much reflection by Tibetan authors on how religion and the law were to be reconciled. To get a glimpse of Tibetan Buddhist legal thinking, we have to read between the lines of prescriptive legal texts, as well as works that describe the juridical process. Now, in recent decades, a number of compilations of older Tibetan legal texts were published in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, as well as in China proper. And some of these volumes of text contain, so this is by the editor, a classification of religious legal texts, Chuchim, and another classification, secular legal text, Sichim. And the religious legal texts then tend to be monastic guidelines, these Jaik. And the distinction here between Tibetan religious rules and secular rules is not just one that was made by these editors, by these contemporary editors, but it was quite common for these older texts to make a similar distinction between what is religious and non-religious, let's say. So it is not uncommon that monastic guidelines written between the 12th and the 12th century and the 1950s refer to secular law, and that secular law books from similar periods refer to the monastic guidelines. And my interest lies in the connection between these two kinds of texts, between the laws for monks and the laws for lay people. So aside from the contents and vocabulary use, authorship connects these two types of legal texts. And this is, of course, obvious when the legal texts are written by, for example, the 5th Dalai Lama, but it is less clear when the author is unknown, and there are quite a few of those, unfortunately. So by reading these works closely and noting the quotations drawn from other types of literature contained in them, we get a better understanding of the ways in which the author was educated and inspired. So to say a little bit about these legal codes, these more or less secular legal texts, we can say that in the Indian Buddhist classical model, the relationship between the king and Buddhist monastics is modeled on that of the advice-giving monk, Kalyana Mitra, if you will, and the well-meaning king who is occasionally prone to violence, perhaps. And this relationship between ruler and spiritual friend, between donor and priest, which is particularly prevalent in the Mahayana tradition, has been extensively studied and commented upon by scholars of Buddhism, most notably, of course, Reg. And while there are instances in which this Buddhist relationship between religion and politics became a historical reality, it appears that more often than not, actually, the two domains, the secular and the Dharma, were not easily distinguishable categories. That is to say, the line between them were often blurry, if they existed at all. So what is maybe, especially speaking to those who do not study Tibet in great detail, what is quite maybe important to know is that the monkhood was very powerful in Tibet, and it's almost unparalleled, especially for Mahayana Buddhism, the way they were powerful, and also the way in which monastic Buddhism had a monopoly position in Tibet. So this is important to keep in mind. And so the presence of a prosperous and powerful Sangha meant that there was less need for the sponsorship and protection of a secular ruler. So economics also coming to that. So in pre-modern Tibet, where monks and monasteries were at times particularly influential, the harmonious merging of the secular and the religious domains became an explicit desideratum. So this is the term Chösisungje in Tibetan. So while lay Tibetans were expected to abide by local secular laws, the monks in their monasteries were meant to keep to their own laws that governed their communities. And these, of course, consisted of pratimoksha vows, the vinaya more generally, other religious vows, more universal Buddhist ethics perhaps, and last but not least, the more localized and often highly pragmatic monastic guidelines these take. Now, these guidelines were often written by religious figures of high standing, and a fair number of surviving sets of guidelines were authored by monks who also had significant political power. So the same monks who wrote the text of regulated monasteries were on occasion also responsible for issuing official decrees, judicial decisions, and possibly also legal codes. One would thus expect there to be considerable similarities between these genres of literature, something on which I will say a bit more later on. That monks had their own laws meant that they were, again in theory, not subject to the laws of the local ruler. In serious cases, as I mentioned before, in serious cases such as murder, this also meant that monastics could get punished twice. First, the monk would be beaten and forcibly disrobed, then expelled, and next he would be a layperson and then tried as a layperson in the secular court. So minor legal cases that involved both monks and lay people were often solved through mediation or through adjudication at the monastery in whose territory the case had taken place. And very often, it seems, the monks had a greater advantage. While the Tibetan tradition claims that law emerged on the basis of Buddhist notions, when Buddhism was first adopted as the royal religion in the 8th century, in fact, legal works preserved in Dunhuang, roughly datable to that time, did not directly reflect Buddhist sentiments. It seems that a legal system was already in place during the height of the Tibetan Empire. So the introduction of Buddhism did in fact sort of promote the development and possible adaptation of new legal codes, which also suggests that the imperial legal codes from the 7th and 8th century reflected at least some of the new religions' influence. In those codes, 4 fundamental laws are given, prohibiting murder, thievery, lechery, and the bearing of false witness. And these works also refer to the 10 non-virtuous acts, which appear to be an obvious reference to the basic Buddhist ethical framework. In other words, and to quote George Dreyfus, Buddhism contributed to the substance of Tibetan laws as well as providing their formal framework. There is no universal agreement on these points, however. Now, Dieter Schull claims that the legal texts that were subsequently produced, and so these legal codes that are seen as the basis for Tibetan law are called Shieje. It's difficult to translate, we will translate them provisionally as pronouncements, so they're seen as something oral pronounced by someone. They were not based, he claims that they were not based on these non-virtuous acts, and he actually argues that the influence of Buddhism was a retrospective, purely fictitious ideological construct. And in a similar way, Van der Kuip has also noted the total absence of anything that might remotely be construed as Buddhist, except for their propagandistic introductions written for the purposes of legitimation and authority. Now, my contention is that while the legal code in these earliest beginnings, that is datable to the early 7th century, may not have been Buddhist, but they most certainly came to integrate Buddhist values as time passed and as legal texts were further edited and elaborated and, say, modernized to accommodate the sentiments of the day. As a result, the legal codes that we end up with, that we can read right now, they contain a mix of notions, ideas, and vocabulary that you can see there sort of layers in there, very old layers with phrases and vocabulary. It's very difficult to understand, and you can see links to the Tibetan that was used in the Dunhuang text, and then it's sort of more modern kind of Tibetan. So we end up with sort of a mixed, weirdly edited texts that were often also badly copied, and it makes them very difficult to read and understand, even for very highly educated readers of Tibetan. Now, perhaps the most well-known and widespread versions of these legal codes is the 16 pronouncements, and nothing of the contents actually suggests as much, but the origin of this code is traditionally attributed to King Sonten Gampo, who is credited with igniting the flame of Buddhism in Tibet. Now, some see the genre of Sheje, of these pronouncements, as being Tibet's constitution, and indeed at certain times in the history of Tibet, certain of these codes did indeed function as something referred to as an authoritative body of rules used to govern the operation of political communities. But at the same time, we also know that informal social legal practices formed, and actually still form, a large part of the social reality in Tibetan regions. Be this as it may, the fact remains that Tibet's literary and oral tradition, now and in the past, points to these texts, these sheje, these pronouncements, as foundational when discussing Tibetan law. Now, we have always assumed that the various of these sheje pronouncements are individual and distinct texts, but they actually that borrow from each other. But when you look closer, it appears that any given sheje text actually bases itself on previous works. Again, always ultimately referring back to the presumed original version written by or pronounced by the Dharma Raja Sonten Gampo. And this actually is reminds, at least it reminds me of the Buddhist genre of the commentarial literature, shastras, that sort of try to clarify, apprise, make relevant the authoritative source, namely the words of the Buddha, the sutras. And in a similar way, according to the tradition, the deified ruler Sonten Gampo, his legal visions are something that you cannot change. Just in the way you cannot change the Buddha's words, you cannot change Sonten Gampo's legal pronouncements. They cannot be contradicted. But what is useful, of course, is that they are not written, or we don't really know what they are. So in that sense, you can be a bit flexible. And also they can be adapted to certain times and circumstances in a way that the sutras can also be explained in different ways according to what is necessary. So a number of variations and adaptations exist of these texts, resulting not just in various numbers of pronouncements, we have 12, 13, 15, 16, but also different contents among the different recensions. So there are a relatively early set of these rules, this legal code, dates roll to the late 14th century, which has been studied by Fernanda Piri, maintains the framework of a list of a set number of laws. And she has said about this, it seems as if the writer has carried out or commissioned a survey of contemporary customs and recorded different practices. And I thought it was really interesting that this is exactly the way in which monastic guidelines, rulebooks, were composed in the past and actually are still composed to this day. So it appears that these pronouncements had a mainly symbolic function in a way, but were deeply ingrained in what has been called the legal consciousness of the Tibetans. And the purpose of the main Tibetan legal codes, in particular after the Gangneung government, headed by the 5th Dalai Lama, was when it was established in 1642. Some have seen this to be pro forma, mere symbolic representations of legal power. And Fernanda Piri has also rightly remarked, I think, there is little evidence that the provisions of rules and agreements were applied in any detail, but still, I have found that different of these codes, of these xieje, they draw upon each other. They cite, they rework, and they reinterpret earlier versions. So much in the way that a Tibetan scholar might actually attempt to make an old Buddhist text from India fit the sensibilities of a much later audience. There appear to have been instances in which authors appear to update and maintain the relevance of the previously existing legal codes by explaining them in the terms of that day. While this is of course not evidence that they were used or applied in a court of law, the regular updating of these texts does suggest that they were far from obsolete to those who dealt with legal matters. Otherwise, why would you update them if they were just merely symbolic, right? So, talking about the monastic side of things, I have mentioned that monks and monasteries generally were not subject to secular laws. And Stan has argued that this is one of the reasons why monasteries should be seen as independent overlords, since, and I quote, monasteries were exempt from tax and services, they can be regarded as independent overlords for their own land and serfs, yielding them taxes and services and discharge all the functions of authority, justice, etc. Unknown, however, is exactly how this legal unit then functioned. And the question also arises to what extent monasteries were autonomous in terms of their jurisdiction. So when considering Buddhist monasticism as an Asian phenomenon, some scholars have suggested that monks are only ever answerable to themselves. In other words, by taking ordination, the vows, the monk is no longer subject to the secular authority and answers only to the Buddhist code of discipline, the Vinaya. Now, the monastic legal code that Tibetan monks adhere to, the Mulasivasivada Vinaya, actually makes it clear that the king must acknowledge that lay law does not apply to the monks and monastic law does not apply to the laymen. The Buddhist, certain Buddhist sutras, such as the Akashikarga Sutra, also reflect this notion. In this particular sutra, so in this particular sutra, the Buddha names 5 transgressions for a member of the Kshatriya caste who is due to become a ruler. And one of these transgressions is the forcibly disrobing or punishing of Buddhist monks, regardless of whether they are innocent in their crimes and transgressions. So taking by force the saffron robes of those who have shaved their heads and beards for my sake and donned the saffron robes, whether they uphold the precepts or not, or whether they observe the discipline or not, thus making them householders, inflicting corporal punishments on them, imprisoning or killing them, all of these constitute the 3rd root transgression. And later on, this very sutra prophesies that monks will, in a future time, resort to plundering and stealing, it says even from temples, in order to pay the fines the ruler has imposed on them, displaying, of course, an awareness of what the ruler's strong legal hold on monastics could lead to. Now, from this and other historically better attested instances, we can gather that the notion of the legally independent renunciant represents a mere ideal, one that has value in and of itself, but which is also ahistorical. The very fact that various Indic Buddhist normative sources emphasize the Sangha's legal autonomy is exactly because it was regularly being challenged. Throughout history, mass forced disrobements of monks or Sangha purifications initiated by secular rulers was a regular occurrence in countries such as China, Mongolia, Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. And naturally, this was more often than not a pretext for political gain and not necessarily done out of concern for the purity of the monkhood. It is perhaps significant that for the case of Tibet, the only time that Tibetan sources attest of such a thing happening, the forcible disrobing of monks, is during the reign of Dharma in the 9th century, who was entered the history books as an anti-Buddhist king, who, as Tibetan Buddhist historiographers later report, who forced monks out of their monasteries and made them wear lay clothes. Later historians suppose actually that Dharma was not the villain he was made out to be, and that he even restored Buddhist monuments during his lifetime. But the decline in monastic Buddhism in central Tibet that followed Dharma's reign was actually more likely to be due to the economic drain posed by the still relatively new phenomenon of monks and monasteries during a time when the region was hit by multiple natural disasters. And of course, clear parallels can be drawn with the large-scale laicization of monks under Emperor Wuzong around the same time in Tang Dynasty China. Perhaps the more pertinent question is how monks then saw themselves and the vows and the monastic rules that they were bound to in relation to secular law. To put this in more abstract terms, what is the relationship between religious ideals and the secular space? According to Ellingson, who was the first Western scholar to investigate the genre of monastic guidelines, he says that these guidelines were based on secular legal codes. A comparison of these guidelines and the extant legal codes of Tibet indeed indicates that, in particular, terminologically and linguistically, there are striking similarities between the two genres. And one of the possible reasons for these similarities is the fact that the authors of the two types of text were often the same person. And this is, of course, also because the educated few, even when they were not monks, were almost always likely to have been trained in a monastery or trained by monks. As mentioned earlier, there were even instances of law codes that were explicitly based on monastic guidelines, such as the one issued by the Bhutanese state, the Code of Conduct, which is still in current use. So while the question as to how exactly monastic guidelines and legal documents are related requires some further investigation, and I'm working on that. My research suggests that the one genre was not necessarily based on the other, but that they were actually strongly related, but they made use of each other. And answering this question involves a more in-depth philological study of these texts and their Buddhist and monastic heritage. I will not go into that because the details will probably be very boring to you. Interesting to me, boring to you. My research into legal texts from the mid-17th century and later has so far revealed that the legal independence enjoyed by many monasteries was not simply asserted by the monastic authorities themselves, it was also deliberately awarded them by the government or by the local ruler. And this notion is indeed clearly stated in many of these texts that I've been working on. And again, these sets of genres of literature refer to each other. The monastic guidelines also tend to stress that monks' behavior should be in accordance with the royal laws, while legal texts issued by rulers emphasize that monastics are to live by their own rules. So my research has shown that the latter works often display an acute awareness of the internal contents of monastic guidelines, suggesting that the author either were informed by monastic agents or had a monastic background themselves. To give an example, a legal edict issued in 1643, possibly the very first to have been issued by the young Ganden Potang government, which started in 1642, addresses all Tibetans of high or low status, monks or lay person, and its authorship is contested, but there are indications that the fifth Dalai Lama was involved in composing it. And the edict addresses the monk community separately, while at the same time also exerting authority over the monasteries and the other religious institutions by stating the following. People who have committed grave offenses such as murder may not be given refuge in the religious institutions. From now on, one is to be wise and successful by remaining in accordance with the Dharma without disregarding instructions established by the general Monkhood, who are in accordance with their own monastic guidelines. And then also you shouldn't pilfer money from the monks. So on the one hand, the decree forbids monasteries from taking in wanted criminals. On the other, it simply reminds the monks that they have their own laws to abide to. It is also very interesting to me that the language used in the text is very similar to monastic guidelines written around the same time. Another legal text written in an earlier time, in the Zhang, during the Zhang dynasty, so this is late 16th, beginning 17th century, also views the monastery as a separate legal entity. It states how people guilty of thieving should be punished by, for example, chopping off the hand, but it also describes how monasteries generally dealt with their own monk thieves. They were to expelled under the sound of the gundi, so this is the bell, and be treated in accordance with the monastery's own set of guidelines. It thus appears that monastic legal independence was not just condoned, but also encouraged by these legal texts. So if the periodization of the legal text is indeed correct, this interdependence of monastic and secular law was not necessarily a result of the unification of church and state, that took place under the fifth Dalai Lama, but actually existed prior to it. And in other legal texts, the genre of Jai, these monastic guidelines, and also by extension monastic law, are referred to numerous times. So my previous research on this genre did not really touch upon the political usage of the genre of monastic guidelines, but here we find that lawmakers were aware of them, they read them, they referred to them, and also invoked the religious authority of these monastic guidelines. So the liberties that monasteries and monks were meant to have had clearly existed in theory, as evidenced by Tibetan legal texts. And by extension, one would presume that monks and monasteries were then also not obliged or not expected to pay taxes. Of course, by looking at taxes, you can often see how the relationships worked in the past. And the number of edicts issued by various rulers reinforced the exemptions monastics tended to enjoy. An edict issued by the fifth Dalai Lama in 1648 for a place, a holy region called Latu, forbids hunting in the region, but it also forbids hindering monks from collecting alms, and also explicitly warns that monastics living in the regions were not meant to be harassed. Another edict written for the abbot of Songdukgun in Kham, so it's currently Sichuan province, on behalf of the seventh Dalai Lama in 1748, similarly reminds the local rulers and inhabitants to allow monks of the monastery to move around freely, to not rob them, to not hinder their access to water and grass, and for the guardians of the road, paths and bridges not to harass them. So the audience of the edict is also a reminder that the monastery should not be taxed in any way. A much earlier, but also again similar legal text written in 1267 by the famous Sakya monk Papa, and then he directed to all people included among the Sakyabhas, big or small. He requests these people to exempt the monks from a certain monastery, trading monastery, to exempt them from military duty, taxes, and labor, from land and commercial taxes, and from giving food and corvée labor. It's quite significant here that Papa writes this at the behest of the king, who is presumably here Kublai Khan. It appears that since this legal note mostly concerns religious matters, which is to say it concerns the Sangha, the problems that the Sangha was facing, the authority lay with the preceptor, so the person writing Papa, rather than with the donor. In other words, with the religious leader and not with the king, but still the king gave authority to do so. So these documents, of which there are many more, confirm the notion that monks and monasteries had their own legal systems, but also that they were perhaps better protected than their lay fellow countrymen by the laws that were upheld outside of their monastic boundaries. Scholars should still be cautious in how they interpret such texts, if indeed all monks and monasteries were and had always been untaxable and not to be harassed in any way. Why would there be a need to confirm this in multiple legal documents? The presence of these prohibitions suggests the fact that monasteries and their inhabitants were indeed occasionally subjected to taxes levied by local rulers, be this legally or illegally. And this is further attested by the famous Mahasiddha Thangtong Gyalpo from the late 14th, beginning of the 15th century, who in his biography written in the 15th century is recorded to have addressed and criticized all leaders of Tibet for their poor leadership. since, and what's maybe also noteworthy is that he was not a monk. He writes, or he's reported to have said, kings in this degenerate age monger for war, disallowing tantrikas and monastics to practice the Dharma. They pursue monasteries for trumped up taxes and corvée labor. They take delight in sinners and cheaters, saying that they are tough boys, tough guys. They accuse those who are innocent of breaking the law when they are not eloquent enough. So the protagonist of this biography, Tangpan Gyalpo, is critical of local rulers of Tibet, whom he called self-centered. So clearly, this author was not a, or this, the protagonist, Tangpan Gyalpo, was not a monk. He merely makes an appeal to the ruler's conscience. He had not much political clout, actually, beyond his charisma and immense popularity among the people of Tibet, and actually also beyond Tibet. Significant here is the notion that raising taxes among the monks is presented as morally abject. Nonetheless, it is implied that these taxes were indeed levied. So the issue of taxes directly addresses the tension between monastic legal independence and the concerns of local rulers seeking to control monks, possibly by limiting their income. Along with the liberties and exemptions that monastic institutions enjoyed, also came responsibilities. For monasteries to remain legal subunits was contingent upon them remaining diligent with respect to specific religious matters. So a decree issued by the fifth Dalai Lama, for example, states that the monastery of Samdali in southwestern Tibet was to be left alone by local rulers, to be allowed to make use of the fields and surroundings, and to be exempt from taxation, but only for as long as the monks would continue to perform rituals for the living and the dead, uphold the Vinaya ritual cycle, make offerings at the temples, and take responsibility for repairs and leaks of the monastic compounds in a proper manner. So this same document also warns that no one can hunt on the monastic grounds. So elsewhere, I have talked about how monks were often burdened with the responsibility of policing their own monastery's territory to actually prevent hunting and other untoward activities. Think of selling alcohol or selling meat. And indeed, when monasteries defaulted on their basic responsibilities, the local rulers or the government were allowed to intervene, which we know they actually did, and not infrequently so. The monk polymath Jamgyum Mipam confirms to the king of Dege, again in Kham, in current-day Sichuan, that the secular ruler is entirely justified to put monks in their place, despite the fact that Buddhist sutras advise against it. This is quite, for me, quite an interesting or significant passage. So he writes, in like fashion, sutras such as the Akasha Garbha and so forth state that our teacher, the Buddha, prohibits the punishment of monks. They state if the followers of the Buddha are subjected to legal punishment, the power of the kingdom's merit diminishes and becomes the reason for its destruction. However, in this degenerate age, there are many monks who are exceedingly unruly. When they cannot be disciplined through the Sangha's councils, religious procedures, then the king needs to do this. So this advice to the king of Dege, which is self-consciously modeled upon Indic Shastras, continues with the procedure of how the king then should relate himself to the Sangha when this happens. The prerogative of the king to purge the Sangha of unwanted elements, often occurring in other Buddhist countries, may have been justified by Buddhist monastic scholars such as Mipam Rinpoche, but in practice, there are very few historical instances that a ruler, even when he was a monk himself, actually managed to bring about large-scale changes among the Sangha in Greater Tibet in such a way. So not from the inside out, but from with external force. This was actually attempted, a large-scale change by the 13th Dalai Lama, who passed away in 1933, but with limited success, and many reforms aimed at the monkhood were actually reversed almost straight away after he passed away. So by contrast, we see that the power relations among the monks and their rulers in Mongolia, for example, were quite different. There are the rulers who, of course, also claimed to uphold the dual system of church and state, actually regularly defrocked and punished monks for actually rather minor transgressions. A Mongolian post-Qing era law code, which covers monastic, criminal, and civil law, which was in place between 1913 and 1918, states that monks caught gambling were to be punished up to 100 strikes of the whip, which is actually, if you look at that law code, it's not dissimilar from the prescribed punishment for lay people. And the difference between the legal privileges of Mongolian and Tibetan monks here is quite remarkable, more so since all monastics involved historically follow Tibetan Buddhism. But that difference may well lie in the fact that many Buddhist monasteries in Tibetan areas, especially from the 17th century onwards, were both politically and economically powerful on a local and translocal level. And in the Mongolian areas, this was less common, that economic autonomy was present. So in Tibet, when monks and monasteries were subjected to government intervention, it was more often than not for political or sectarian reasons, but no large-scale Sangha purifications ever took place. So even there's an example of the 13th Dalai Lama taking on a very powerful monastery, Jebung Monastery, but in the end, he was rather successful. He triumphed over thousands of rebellious monks, but I would say this was quite sort of historical anomaly. And when we also look at the Dalai Lama sort of on the longue durée, then only actually the 5th and the 13th and maybe also the 14th actually held any real significant power or sway over the people. So the monastic antipathy towards government intervention, this is something you can definitely see as a sort of a historical thread, but of course it has become even more distinct in the last 70 years, during which Tibetan monasteries have had to deal with the highly repressive People's Republic of China. So when in the 1980s, the monasteries were rebuilt and monastic education was reestablished, the tendency towards monastic legal autonomy was also rekindled to some extent. And many of the current day protests, which are initiated by monks and laity alike, actually fundamentally arise from structural repression, but are often initially set off by the government's interference in monastic affairs. An example of this is the large-scale protest that resulted from the attempts by the Chinese Communist government to reinstate the Great Prayer Festival I talked about earlier. They tried to do this in 1986, and this age-old festival had been used by the Tibetan government to strengthen its bond with the Sangha. And during this sort of 3-week period, then monks from the 3 large Gelug monasteries in and near Lhasa would flock towards the city to conduct prayers for the success of the Tibetan government. So this is significant. Now in 1986, monks refusing to pray on behalf of the repressive communist government protested the mandate to attend, which resulted in large-scale arrests. Subsequent boycotts and further arrests eventually sparked the riots that took place on March 5th, 1988. And violent attempts to quell these riots resulted in an unknown number of deaths. So similar protests that in many cases have to do with religious self-determination crop up time and again in Chinese rural Tibetan areas, and understanding the historical precedent for these protests to be based in the long tradition of monastic legal autonomy is helpful, I think, in comprehending the regularity and vehemence with which they occur. So to conclude, the very basic function of monastic law, as understood by monastic authors themselves, is rather similar, if not identical, to law outside of the Tibetan monastery. Laws, and by extension justice, essentially serve to secure social order in both milieus. In Tibetan societies, where the government has traditionally been a symbolically prominent, yet functionally absent entity, the distinction between law and customs, or for that matter, law and morality, are less easily made. And the same may perhaps be said for other Buddhist traditions in Asia. So Buddhist morality and secular law ultimately are both normative social practices and also symbolic expressions of social values. So religion, to generalize, and also by extension, so religion and by extension Buddhism, viewed by scholars as providing a means of social control, which implies, to cite Richard Gombrich, a system of rewards and punishments, either internalized during socialization or externally supplied by institutions or both. And these two kinds of legal codes thus existed symbiotically in order to support this social order. So what I want to emphasize here is that monks, or maybe to be more specific, monastic members of a monastery, had a special legal status that awarded them significantly more liberties than lay Tibetans. At the same time, monastic institutions were supposed to pay for those liberties by carrying out duties that were seen as essentially the responsibility of monks. When a monastery neglected these religious ritual and social duties, its special legal status was nullified, which could potentially have severe consequences. So the bodies of rules that governed the monastery and its inhabitants, as well as those which governed the rest of the Tibetans, actually display an awareness and an acceptance of the status of the monastic institution. And these two subject genres of legal works clearly influenced each other, not just because their authors were often one and the same, but also because the inherently Buddhist value of putting the Sangha first was shared among all legal actors. Now, to return to the question of what is Buddhist about law, in this case Tibetan law, we come to see that religious allowances, but also religious responsibilities regarding the monasteries and the monks are integral to the legal charters and codes that span a number of centuries. And we find then that Buddhism is not present in the law in the form of a set of ethics, mind training, or a philosophy, but it is there, and I would argue that it's very much there, in the way in which the custodians of Buddhism, the Sangha, the Monkhood, are treated, both according to prescriptive Tibetan law texts and descriptive ones. So, and I would like to end it here. So maybe in the case of Tibetan law, it shouldn't be Buddhist is as Buddhist does, but Buddhist is as the Sangha does.